"You're not what I asked for." Charlotte froze on the platform carpet bag, clutched to her chest, as the tall stranger studied her torn dress, like she was a debt he hadn't agreed to pay. The wind cut through Montana like a blade. The whole town watched, waiting for her to cry, to break to prove them right about the woman who arrived with nothing. She didn't. "Then we're even," she said, "because you're not what I expected either." If you want to know what happened next, hit subscribe and follow this story to the very end. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The train screamed into Iron Creek Station with a violence that made half the platform flinch, steam hissing across the boards like something dying. Charlotte Bennett did not flinch. She had run out of things that could startle her 3 states ago. She stepped down with her chin lifted and her bag held in both hands. The handle wrapped twice around her palm because the leather had split somewhere outside Cheyenne and she hadn't had the coin to fix it. Her dress was gray once. Now it was the color of old rain patched at the hem where she'd sewn it herself by lantern light, using thread pulled from a coat she no longer owned. Her boots had been resoled with strips of harness leather. She knew what she looked like. She had stopped pretending otherwise the day she sold her mother's locket for train fare. The platform went quiet around her, and not the polite kind of quiet. A woman in a green wool coat leaned toward her companion and didn't bother lowering her voice. "That's her?" "That's the mail-order bride. Lord help Nathan Carter," the companion murmured back. "He ordered a wife, and the railroad sent him a beggar." Charlotte heard every word. She let it pass through her the way wind passes through a fence present felt, but not stopped by anything. She had learned that in Ohio in the boarding house where she'd scrubbed floors for a woman who called her girl instead of her name. She had learned it again on the 3-week journey west, sleeping upright in coach seats, while finer women slept in private berths and looked at her like she'd tracked something unpleasant onto the train. She was 25 years old, and she had exactly $4 and a letter in her bag. And the letter was the only thing in the world that still had her name spelled right. "Dear Miss Bennett, I am a rancher with property near Iron Creek, Montana Territory. I am raising my nephew, age 9, alone. I require a wife who is capable, honest, and willing to work. I cannot offer you comfort. I can offer you a home and my word that you will be treated fairly. Nathan Carter." She had read it 40 times on the way here. Not because it was romantic, because it was the first letter she'd ever received that didn't ask her to apologize for existing. A man broke from the crowd at the edge of the platform. He was tall, in a way that made the space around him feel smaller, broad through the shoulders, from years of work that didn't care how tired you were. His hat was pushed back, his jaw set, and his eyes, when they found her, did something Charlotte wasn't prepared for. They didn't move down her body the way men's eyes sometimes did, cataloging and judging. They went straight to her face and stayed there. "Miss Bennett?" His voice was low, rough at the edges, a voice that didn't get much practice being gentle. "Mr. Carter." She made herself meet his eyes instead of looking away, because looking away was what they all expected, and she was so tired of giving people what they expected. He looked at her bag, at her dress, at the place on her sleeve where she'd mended a tear with thread 2 shades wrong because it was the only thread she had. "You're not what I asked for," he said. The words landed like a slap, flat and plain, no cruelty in the delivery, but no mercy in it either. Somewhere behind her, the woman in the green coat made a small, satisfied sound, like she'd been waiting all morning to hear exactly that. Charlotte felt her face go hot. She felt 25 years of being looked at and found wanting rise up in her throat like bile. And then, because she had nothing left to lose and no further down to fall, she straightened her spine and looked him dead in the eye. "Then we're even," she said, "because you're not what I expected either." Something shifted in his face. Not quite surprise. Closer to recognition, like he'd thrown a punch expecting it to land on air, and instead it had been caught. "I expected a man who wrote me a letter asking for honesty." Charlotte continued before he could recover, before her courage could fail her, the way it had failed her so many times before. Not a man who judges a woman's worth by the state of her hem before she's said 3 words to him. A ripple went through the crowd. Someone laughed, not unkindly, more startled than anything, and quickly smothered it. Nathan Carter stared at her for a long moment. Then, to Charlotte's complete astonishment, the corner of his mouth twitched. "Fair," he said. He stepped forward and reached for her bag. She held on to it a half-second too long, an old reflex, the reflex of a woman who had learned that anything held loosely got taken from her. He noticed. His hand paused. "I'm not taking it from you," he said quietly, "just for her. I'm carrying it for you. There's a difference." She let go. His fingers brushed the split seam in the leather, and something crossed his face. Not pity, she would have hated pity, would have rather he'd mocked her openly than pitied her, but something more like understanding. Like a man recognizing the weight of a thing because he'd carried something just as heavy once himself. "This bag's seen some miles," he said. "So have I," Charlotte answered. He almost smiled again. He caught it before it fully arrived, like smiling wasn't a habit he kept in good practice. But Charlotte saw the shadow of it anyway, and something in her chest loosened for the first time since Ohio. They walked together toward a wagon at the edge of the lot, and the whispers followed them the whole way. "3 months' wages he spent getting her here," a man said to his friend, not bothering to whisper either. "And she shows up looking like she walked the whole way." "Maybe she did," the friend said, and they both laughed. Charlotte kept her eyes forward. Nathan's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking near his ear, but he said nothing to the men. Instead, he set her bag in the wagon bed with a care that surprised her, not tossed, not dropped, but placed like it held something worth protecting. And then he turned and offered her his hand to help her up onto the seat. She looked at the offered hand. Calloused, scarred across 2 knuckles. Steady. She took it. His grip was warm and sure, and he lifted her up onto the seat, like she weighed nothing at all, like the climb that would have cost her effort and dignity in equal measure cost him no thought whatsoever. When she was settled, he didn't immediately let go. For just a moment, his thumb passed once over the back of her hand. Not a caress. Nothing so forward as that, more like a man checking that something fragile hadn't broken in transit. Then he released her and walked around to climb up on the other side. They rode in silence for the first mile. Charlotte watched the town fall away behind them, the buildings growing smaller, the whispers growing fainter, until there was nothing around them but open land rolling gold and brown toward mountains so distant they looked painted onto the sky. She had never seen country like this. It frightened her a little, the size of it, the emptiness. It also, in some way she couldn't name yet, made her feel like she could finally breathe. "You're staring," Nathan said, not looking at her eyes on the road. "I've never seen anything this big," Charlotte admitted. "Where I'm from, you could walk to the edge of town in 20 minutes. This just doesn't stop. Takes some getting used to." A pause. "Winter especially. It gets big in a different way come January. Big and quiet and mean." "I'm not afraid of work," she said, because she sensed that was the real question underneath his words. "Or cold. Or quiet." "Good," he said, "because there's plenty of all three out here." Another mile passed. Charlotte found herself studying his profile when she thought he wasn't looking, the set of his jaw, the lines at the corner of his eyes that spoke of squinting into too much sun, the way his hands held the reins like they'd been doing it since before he could walk. He didn't look like a man who smiled often. He looked like a man who had learned the hard way that softness cost something he couldn't always afford to spend. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "Why me?" "You could have written to any number of women back east, women with proper dresses and proper manners and families who'd send them off with a trunk full of linens." She heard the bitterness creep into her own voice and didn't try to hide it. Why answer a letter from a woman with nothing? Nathan was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer at all. "Because your letter didn't lie to me," he said finally. "Every other woman who wrote about how much she wanted a family, how she'd always dreamed of the frontier, how she was sure we'd suit each other beautifully, even though she'd never laid eyes on me." His mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "Your letter said you needed work and a roof, and you'd give an honest day for both. No flowers. No dreams. Just truth." Charlotte felt something tighten in her throat. That's not romantic. No, he agreed. But I've had enough of pretty lies to last me a lifetime. I'll take truth in a torn dress over comfort in a lie any day. She didn't know what to say to that. So she said nothing and watched the mountains grow slowly larger and let herself, just for a moment, hope. The ranch came into view an hour later, a low timber house with smoke curling from its chimney, a barn standing solid and weathered beside it, fences stretching out toward pasture where cattle moved like slow dark clouds across the gold grass. It wasn't grand. It wasn't the kind of place that would impress the women in green wool coats back at the station. But it was real, and it was standing, and someone had clearly built it with their own 2 hands and kept it alive through hard winters. A boy stood on the porch. He was small for 9. Charlotte thought thin in the way of children who'd grown too fast through grief rather than years. He had Nathan's dark hair and a face that should have belonged to a child, but wore the careful blankness of someone much older. He didn't run to greet the wagon. He didn't wave. He stood very still, watching them approach with eyes that gave away nothing at all. "That's Owen," Nathan said quietly, and something in his voice changed, softened and hardened at once, the way a man's voice does when he's talking about something he'd burn the world down to protect. "He doesn't talk much. Hasn't, not really, since his folks died. My brother and his wife." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Owen was in the house when it happened. Fire. He got out. They didn't." Charlotte's chest ached. "How long ago?" 3 years. "And he hasn't spoken since." "He speaks. Words when he needs something. Yes and no, and pass the salt." Nathan pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. "But he hasn't really talked. Not the way a boy his age ought to talk. Not since." Charlotte looked at the boy on the porch, at the careful stillness of him, the way he held himself like a held breath, and something inside her, something that had been clenched tight since Ohio, since the boarding house, since every place that had ever made her feel like a burden, instead of a person, loosened just slightly. She knew that stillness. She had worn it herself once, in the months after her own mother died, and her father had looked at her like she was a bill he hadn't budgeted for. "Hello, Owen," she said, climbing down from the wagon before Nathan could come around to help her. She didn't approach the boy. She'd learned that much from her own grief. That approach felt like a threat, like one more thing being taken without asking. She simply stood where she was, a respectful distance away, and let him look at her as long as he needed to. Owen's eyes moved over her, the torn dress, the patched boots, the carpet bag with the split seam, with the same merciless honesty the townspeople had shown. But where their eyes had held judgment, his held something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. He didn't say anything. He turned and went into the house. "That's about as warm a welcome as you'll get for a while," Nathan said, climbing down and reaching for her bag again. "Don't take it personal." "I wasn't planning to," Charlotte said. And she meant it. She understood that boy in a way she suspected Nathan, for all his love, could not. She understood what it was to have the ground taken out from under you and to decide somewhere deep down that the only safe thing left to do was stop reaching for anything at all. Inside the house was clean but bare. The bareness not of poverty, but of a household run by a man and a boy who'd never had reason to make a place beautiful, only functional. A man's house, Charlotte thought, that had forgotten it could be a home. "Your room's through there," Nathan said, nodding toward a door off the main room. "It's small. It's clean. There's a lock on the inside if you want it." Charlotte looked at him sharply. "I'm not—" He stopped, jaw tightening like the words were difficult to get out. "I want to be clear about something, Miss Bennett. This is an arrangement. I need help with Owen with the house, with the work. I need a wife in name so the bank doesn't ask questions about a man raising a boy alone, and so Owen has someone steady in his life besides me. I'm not expecting—" He stopped again, color rising faintly above his collar, a sight so unexpected on a man who looked otherwise carved from stone that Charlotte almost smiled despite everything. "I'm not expecting anything from you that you're not willing to give freely. Your room is yours. The lock is yours to use. It was, Charlotte realized, the kindest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once sharp, like a man closing a ledger, and turned toward the door. "Supper's at 6. I'll show you the kitchen, but I expect you'll find your own way around it faster than I could explain it." "Mr. Carter?" He paused. "I know I'm not what you expected," Charlotte said, and there was no bitterness in it now, just a plain and steady truth she needed to set down between them like a stone on solid ground. "I know what I look like. I know what the town thinks. But I give you my word, I will work harder than any woman you could have ordered from a catalog with a full trunk and a pretty face. I will earn my place here. I don't expect anything given to me free." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't read. "A woman isn't measured by what she carries," he said, finally quiet and rough, like the words cost him something to say out loud. "Only by what she carries inside her heart." Then he was gone, boots heavy on the porch steps, leaving Charlotte standing alone in the bare front room of a house that wasn't yet her home, holding a bag with a split seam and a heart that hadn't dared to hope in longer than she could remember. She set the bag down on the narrow bed in her new room and sat beside it, and for the first time since her mother's funeral, Charlotte Bennett allowed herself to cry, not from grief, not from humiliation, but from something far more dangerous and far more fragile. Hope. She did not stay seated for long. Crying had never put food on a table or earned a man's respect, and Charlotte had learned both lessons in the hardest classroom there was. She splashed water on her face from the basin in the corner, smoothed her hair back as best she could, and went looking for the kitchen. It was worse than she'd expected, and better than she'd feared. The stove was old, but solid. The shelves half bare, the whole room carrying the particular emptiness of a kitchen, run by people who cooked to survive rather than to nourish. Flour in a tin, salt pork, a few withered carrots, no spice beyond salt and pepper, no bread rising anywhere, no sign that warmth had touched this room in longer than Charlotte cared to guess. She rolled up her sleeves. By the time the light outside started turning gold toward evening, she had a fire built proper in the stove biscuits she'd made from memory, rising in a pan, and a pot of beans, seasoned with the last of the salt pork, and an onion she'd found gone soft in the cellar, but still good enough to use. It wasn't a feast. It was what she had. But it was hot, and it was made with care, and care was something Charlotte suspected this house hadn't tasted in years. She heard the door open behind her, and turned to find Owen standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her with that same unreadable stillness. "Hello again," she said, and went back to her work, not pushing, not demanding anything of him. She set a biscuit on a small plate and slid it across the counter toward him without comment, the way you might leave food for a wild thing too skittish to take it from your hand. Owen looked at the biscuit, looked at her. After a long moment, he crossed the kitchen, took the plate, and retreated to the table where he sat and ate in silence, watching her the whole time. "Good?" she asked. He nodded. One small nod. It was... Charlotte thought the first real answer anyone in this house had given her all day, and it meant more to her than anything Nathan had said on the long ride from the station. She was setting the table when Nathan came in from the barn, stopping in the doorway, with an expression Charlotte couldn't quite name, somewhere between confusion and something gentler, softer, like a man walking into a memory he hadn't let himself visit in years. "You cooked," he said. "I told you I'd earn my place." She set the last plate down. "Sit. Before it goes cold." He sat. They ate in a silence that felt different from the silence of the wagon ride. Not awkward, not strained, but something settling slowly into place like furniture, finding its proper position in a room. Owen finished his beans, and for the first time since Charlotte had arrived, looked at her directly, not with suspicion, but with something that might give in time become trust. "This is good," Nathan said, finally gruff, like the words had to fight their way out of him. "Better than anything I've made in 3 years. It's just beans and biscuits." "It's the first hot meal that's tasted like someone wanted us to have it," he said, and then looked almost surprised at himself for saying it like the sentiment had escaped before he could catch it. Charlotte felt her face warm. Well, someone did. That night, lying in the narrow bed in her new room, listening to wind move across land so vast it seemed to breathe. Charlotte Bennett thought about the letter in her bag, about the man with the careful eyes and the careless words, about the silent boy who'd taken a biscuit from a stranger's hand. She thought about the town that had laughed at her rags and the man who had looked past them to something else entirely. She did not know yet what this house would ask of her. She did not know about the winter coming, about the danger waiting in it, about how close she would come to losing everything, just as she'd finally begun to find something worth keeping. She only knew that for the first time in 3 long hard years, she had fallen asleep without crying herself there, and somewhere down the hall, behind a door, he kept carefully closed. Nathan. Carter lay awake, far longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, turning over in his mind, the sound of a woman's laugh in his kitchen, the sight of his nephew eating a stranger's biscuit like it was the finest meal in the territory, and the unsettling, unfamiliar feeling that something in his carefully guarded house had shifted quietly, irreversibly, the moment Charlotte Bennett stepped off that train. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself it was only a hot meal and a tired mind playing tricks. He did not yet know how wrong he was. The morning after that first supper, Charlotte was awake before the sun because lying still in a strange bed gave her mind too much room to wander, and wandering minds had never done her any favors. She found the kitchen cold, the fire long dead, and set about rebuilding it with hands that already knew this house's rhythms better than she expected after only one night. She was elbow-deep in dough when Nathan walked in, stopping just inside the door, hat still on, like he hadn't expected to find anyone awake before him. "You're up early," he said. "I'm used to early." She didn't look up from the dough. "Where I worked before sleeping past dawn meant losing your position." "This isn't a boarding house." "No," Charlotte agreed. "It's better. Nobody's watching to see if I steal the silver." Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Charlotte was starting to recognize the shape of it, the way some men kept their feelings locked behind a door that opened only a crack at a time. He grabbed a biscuit from the basket she'd left cooling and ate it standing like a man who'd forgotten meals were meant to be sat through. "There's a chair," she said. "There's work," he answered. But he sat anyway, just for a moment, just long enough to finish the biscuit, and Charlotte counted that as a small victory. Owen appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, hair uncombed, eyes still heavy with sleep, and stopped when he saw her standing at the stove like she belonged there. He didn't say good morning. He never did. But he came to the table and sat, and when Charlotte set a plate in front of him, he ate without hesitation, which she'd already learned was its own kind of conversation with this boy. "Owen," Nathan said, standing and brushing crumbs from his shirt. "Chores before school today. Mrs. Whitfield's expecting you at 8. Owen's shoulders tightened. He didn't look up from his plate. "He doesn't like school?" Charlotte asked once Nathan had stepped out to the barn, leaving the two of them alone in the kitchen for the first time. Owen shrugged the universal language of boys who didn't want to explain themselves. "I didn't like school either," Charlotte offered, scraping the last of the batter into the pan. "Not because of the lessons, because the other children were cruel, and I never knew which version of cruel I'd be facing each morning." Owen's eyes lifted to hers, just for a second. But it was the longest he'd looked at her since she'd arrived, and Charlotte felt something settle between them, not trust yet, but the first thin thread of it, spun out of nothing more than a shared and unspoken understanding. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Charlotte hadn't known she was starving for. She rose before dawn and worked until well after dark, and every hour of it felt different from the labor she'd known back east. Not because the work was lighter. It wasn't. It was harder than anything she'd done in her life, but because for the first time the work was hers. Nobody stood over her shoulder waiting for her to fail. Nobody counted her mistakes, like coins in a jar, ready to dock her wages for each one. She mended every torn shirt in Nathan's wardrobe before she let herself sew a single stitch for her own new dress, working by lamplight after Owen was asleep. and Nathan had gone to check the stock one final time. She patched and turned collars, let out seams that had gone tight across his shoulders from years of labor, and when she finally did sit down to make herself something new from the bolt of plain blue cloth she'd bought with 3 of her last $4, she did it slowly, carefully, like a woman savoring something she didn't quite believe she was allowed to have. "You've been at that needle every night this week," Nathan observed one evening, coming in from the barn to find her by the lamp blue cloth spread across her lap. "Someone had to fix your shirts before they fell apart on your back." "My shirts could have waited." "They could have," Charlotte agreed, not looking up. "But a man who works as hard as you do shouldn't have to do it with his elbow showing through his sleeve." Nathan stood there a moment longer than the conversation required, watching her hands move the needle in small, sure strokes, watching the lamplight catch gold in her hair, and something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the cold coming through the walls. "Charlotte." She looked up. It was the first time he'd used her given name instead of Miss Bennet, and the sound of it in his rough voice did something strange to her pulse. "You don't have to give Owen the bigger portion at supper," he said. "I've noticed. Every night. You serve him first, you serve me second, and you take whatever's left, even when there's barely enough left to call a meal." Charlotte's hands stilled on the fabric. "I'm not hungry." "You're always not hungry," Nathan said, and there was something rough and almost angry in his voice now, though she understood even then that the anger wasn't aimed at her. "I've watched you push food around your plate 3 nights running and call it eating." "Nathan, I won't have it." He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her chair, close enough that she could see the worry carved into the lines around his eyes. Worry she hadn't expected, hadn't dared to hope for. "You're not a guest here scraping by on what's left over. You're not a servant earning her keep on half rations. You eat. Same as Owen, same as me. That's not a request." Charlotte felt her throat tighten, felt tears threatening in a way that embarrassed her, because she had cried more in this house in 1 week than she had in the 3 years before it. "I spent a long time," she said quietly, "in places where what was left over was all I was ever offered. I suppose I forgot how to take more than that." Nathan's jaw worked. For a moment, Charlotte thought he might reach for her hand, and some traitorous part of her wanted him to. He didn't. But his voice, when it came, was gentler than she'd yet heard it. "You're not in that place anymore," he said. "You're here. And here you eat first, if I have anything to say about it." The whispers from town didn't stop even out at the ranch, even weeks into Charlotte's new life. They arrived secondhand, carried by the mail carrier, by the man who delivered feed by Mrs. Whitfield herself, who made a point of mentioning in front of Charlotte that half of Iron Creek was placing bets on how long the rag bride would last before Nathan Carter came to his senses and sent her packing. Charlotte heard it and said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing with gossip only fed it. Nathan heard it differently. "Sarah Whitfield said what?" His voice cracked across the kitchen like a gunshot, loud enough that Owen flinched at the table. "It doesn't matter," Charlotte said quickly, setting down the knife she'd been using to peel potatoes. "Truly, Nathan, it doesn't—" "It matters to me." He was already reaching for his hat. "I'll have a word with her husband at the feed store tomorrow, and he can pass along exactly what I think of his wife's gossip." "You'll do no such thing." Charlotte stood, planting herself between him and the door with a boldness that surprised them both. "If you go marching into town defending my honor, you only prove to them that there's something worth gossiping about. Let them talk. Let them wonder. I won't give them the satisfaction of watching it bother me." Nathan stared at her, hat in hand, something working behind his eyes that looked almost like respect fighting its way through frustration. "You're a stubborn woman, Charlotte Bennet." "I had to learn to be." He set the hat back on its hook, slow, reluctant, like a man laying down a weapon he'd rather have used. "Fine, we won't go to town, but I won't sit quiet while they call you names behind your back, even if I don't say a word to their faces." It was, Charlotte thought, the closest thing to a declaration of loyalty she had received from any man in her life, and she carried the warmth of it with her, long after he'd gone back out to the barn. Owen's silence began to crack, first not all at once, not in any way Charlotte could point to and call a victory, but in small fractures that accumulated like frost, spreading slowly across glass. It started with the garden. Charlotte had decided in her second week that the bare patch of dirt behind the house deserved better than to sit fallow through what remained of the growing season, and she'd enlisted Owen's help without asking him outright, simply handing him a trowel one afternoon and kneeling down beside the cold earth like his participation was assumed. "We're putting in winter greens," she said, not looking at him, working the soil with practiced hands. "Kale, some hardy lettuce, things that won't mind the frost." Owen knelt beside her silent, but he took the trowel. They worked in companionable quiet for the better part of an hour, Charlotte narrating her actions without demanding response. "Here you want the roots loose like this. You don't want to crowd them. Give them room to breathe until Owen, without warning, without any build-up, Charlotte could have predicted, asked a question. "Did somebody teach you this?" 2 sentences, 6 words. Charlotte nearly dropped her trowel from the shock of it, but she kept her hand steady and her voice even, because she understood with the instinct of someone who'd once been exactly this guarded, exactly this careful, that any overreaction would slam the door shut again. "My mother," she said simply, "before she died." Owen's hands stilled in the dirt. "My mother had a garden too." "Did she?" "Roses, by the porch." His voice was small, rusty, like a hinge that hadn't moved in years. "They burned with the house." Charlotte's chest ached so fiercely she had to breathe through it before she could answer. She did not reach for him. She did not pull him into an embrace he hadn't asked for, however badly she wanted to. She simply kept her hands moving in the soil, kept her voice low and steady, and let him set the pace. "We could plant roses here," she said. "Next spring, if you wanted." Owen looked at the dirt for a long moment. "Okay," he said. It was the first whole conversation he'd had with anyone, Nathan later told her, in over a year. That night, after Owen had gone to bed, Nathan found Charlotte sitting alone on the porch steps, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill, looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains, against a sky thick with stars she'd never seen so clearly in her life. "He told me," Nathan said, sitting down beside her without asking close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "About the garden, about his mother's roses. He told you. More words than I've heard out of him in months." Nathan's voice was thick with something Charlotte hadn't heard from him before. Not quite emotion. Men like Nathan didn't easily admit to emotion, but something adjacent to it, something straining at the edges of his careful control. "I don't know how you did it." "I didn't do anything. I just gave him room." "That's not nothing, Charlotte." He turned to look at her, and in the starlight, his face had lost some of its careful hardness, looked younger, more open than she'd yet seen it. "I've been giving him room for 3 years, tiptoeing around him like he was made of glass. You walk in here a week ago and hand him a trowel like it's the most natural thing in the world, and he opens up to you like—" He stopped, shook his head. "I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to thank me." Charlotte pulled the shawl tighter, suddenly aware of how close he was sitting, how the warmth of him seemed to push back against the autumn cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He's a good boy. He just needed someone who understood what it was to lose everything and still be expected to keep living. You understand that. It wasn't a question. Charlotte looked out at the mountains instead of at him. "My mother died when I was 17, she said quietly. "My father remarried within the year to a woman who made it very clear there wasn't room in the house for a daughter who reminded him of his first wife. I left when I was 19. Worked in a boarding house in Ohio for 6 years, scrubbing floors and mending linens for a woman who docked my pay if I broke a dish or spoke out of turn." She heard her own voice go flat, the way it always did when she recited these facts, like reciting them flatly made them hurt less. "I answered your letter because I was tired of being someone's burden. I wanted just once to be someone's help instead." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped low, rough with something Charlotte couldn't yet name. "You're not a burden here," he said. "You haven't been since the moment you stepped off that train, no matter what the fools in town whisper about you. You walked into this house and made it warmer in a week than it's been in 3 years." Charlotte turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, close enough now that she could see the firelight from the window catching gold in his eyes, close enough that her breath caught somewhere in her chest, and refused to move. "Nathan, I know," he said quickly, leaning back, putting distance between them like a man retreating from a fire he'd gotten too close to. "I know this is an arrangement. I know I said I wouldn't expect anything you weren't willing to give freely. I just—" He exhaled hard, dragging a hand down his face. "I wanted you to know you're not invisible here. Not to me." He stood and went inside before Charlotte could find words to answer him, and she sat alone on the porch steps a long while after, her heart pounding in a way she hadn't felt in years, wondering what exactly was beginning to grow between them in this house that had started only weeks ago as nothing more than an arrangement of convenience. The first real test of that fragile new warmth came on market day, 3 weeks into Charlotte's life at the ranch, when Nathan insisted she come into town with him to sell the season's wool. "You don't have to," he said, watching her hesitate by the wagon, her hands smoothing nervously over the blue dress she'd finally finished sewing, simple but clean, the first new garment she'd owned in years. "I know what they'll say. I know what they'll say, too." Charlotte lifted her chin. "I'd rather hear it to my face than imagine it behind my back." The drive into Iron Creek felt longer than the distance warranted, tension coiling tighter in Charlotte's stomach with every passing mile. And when they finally pulled into the main street, she felt the eyes turn toward them, before the wagon had even come to a full stop. "There she is," someone murmured, not quite quiet enough. "The rag bride. New dress, I see." Another voice added, dripping with false sweetness. "Did Carter finally take pity and buy her something decent?" Charlotte felt her face heat, felt the old familiar urge to shrink, to apologize, to make herself small enough that the cruelty would slide past without catching. She had spent 6 years learning that urge had it carved so deep into her bones it felt like instinct rather than choice. She did not shrink. "I made it myself," she said loud enough to carry, turning to face the women who'd spoken with a steadiness that surprised even her. "Every stitch. The same way I make every meal in that house, mend every shirt, and tend every chore that needs doing from sunup to dark. I'd ask what you ladies have made with your own 2 hands lately, but I suspect the answer might embarrass you." The street went quiet. Nathan beside her made a sound that might have been a cough, or might have been a poorly suppressed laugh. The woman who'd spoken, stout, well-dressed, clearly used to being the one who delivered the cutting remark, rather than received one, opened her mouth, closed it, and finally turned and walked away, with her companion trailing after her, both of them muttering in a way that no longer sounded quite so confident. "Remind me," Nathan said under his breath, helping her down from the wagon, "never to get on your bad side." "You're in no danger," Charlotte said, though she felt her pulse still racing from the confrontation. "You've been nothing but fair to me." "Fair," Nathan repeated, like the word tasted strange to him suddenly, and something in the way he looked at her made Charlotte's breath catch all over again. It was at the feed store, an hour later, that Charlotte first heard the name that would come to mean trouble for all of them. Carter. A man approached, expensively dressed for a frontier town, his boots too clean for someone who claimed to work the land, his smile too practiced to be entirely trustworthy. "Heard you finally took a wife. Didn't expect her to be quite so—" His eyes flicked over Charlotte's dress, lingered a beat too long. "Resourceful. Hollis." Nathan's voice had gone flat, cold, in a way Charlotte hadn't heard from him before, every trace of warmth vanishing. "What do you want?" "Can't a man offer congratulations?" The man? Hollis smiled wider, but his eyes stayed sharp, calculating, moving between Nathan and Charlotte like he was assessing a hand of cards. "Heard your herd's been thin this year. Heard the bank's been asking questions about your note." "My business with the bank is my business." "Course it is." Hollis tipped his hat, the gesture somehow more insulting than respectful. "Just hate to see good land go to waste is all." Man like me, I've got buyers lined up for property like yours. Real interested buyers. You ever want to talk numbers, you know where to find me. I won't. Hollis's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. Annoyance maybe, or the particular irritation of a man unused to hearing no. Suit yourself, Carter. For now. His gaze cut to Charlotte one final time, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl despite the politeness of his expression. Mrs. Carter. A pleasure. He walked away, and Charlotte felt Nathan's whole body still tense beside her, watching the man go with an expression she could only describe as barely contained fury. Who was that? She asked quietly. Garrett Hollis. Nathan's jaw was tight enough that the words came out clipped. Land speculator. He's been circling half the ranches in this territory for 2 years, buying up failing operations for pennies and reselling the water rights to the railroad. He's been after my land since my brother died. Why yours specifically? Because my creek feeds 3 other properties downstream, Nathan said. Whoever controls my water controls 1/3 of the valley's grazing land. Hollis knows it. He's been waiting for me to fail, waiting for one bad winter to put me far enough behind on the note that I'd have no choice but to sell. Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Are you behind on the note? Nathan didn't answer right away, and his silence told her more than words could have. Nathan, it's manageable, he said finally, though his voice carried none of the confidence the words were meant to convey. This year's wool sale, the cattle in spring, it's manageable. I just need a good winter. One good winter, and we're clear. Charlotte looked toward the direction Hollis had disappeared toward the careful smile and the calculating eyes and felt, for the first time since arriving in Iron Creek, a fear that had nothing to do with whispers or torn dresses or the judgment of strangers. This was a different kind of threat. This was the kind that could take everything. The house, the land, the fragile, precious warmth that had only just begun growing between them, and Charlotte understood with sudden and complete clarity that whatever happened this winter would decide far more than whether they had enough wool sold or enough cattle fattened for market. It would decide whether this family, barely a family at all, barely 3 weeks old, would survive to become one at all. Dr. J. The ride home was quieter than the ride into town, both of them turning over the weight of Hollis's words in their own private silence, until Owen, who'd stayed home with Mrs. Whitfield for his lessons and met them at the gate when they returned, looked up at his uncle's face and asked with the unsettling perceptiveness children sometimes carried, "What happened?" "Nothing," Nathan said too quickly, too firmly. Owen's eyes moved to Charlotte instead, silently asking the same question, and Charlotte found she couldn't lie to him, not when he'd only just begun trusting her with his words. "A man in town wants to buy your uncle's land," she said honestly. "Your uncle said no. Will he ask again?" "Probably," Charlotte admitted. Owen considered this with a solemnity that seemed too heavy for a 9-year-old's shoulders. "He won't get it," he said finally with a certainty that surprised them both. "This is our land. Mama and Papa are buried on the hill behind the barn. We're not leaving them." The simple, fierce conviction in his voice broke something open in Charlotte's chest, and she saw the same emotion crack across Nathan's face, the raw, unguarded love of a man who would do anything, sacrifice anything to protect this boy, and the only home he had left. "That's right," Nathan said, voice thick. "We're not going anywhere." That night, after Owen was asleep and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Charlotte found Nathan in the barn sitting on an overturned crate, staring at nothing in particular, the weight of the day still etched across his face. "You should be asleep," she said, stepping inside, a lantern in her hand, casting warm light across the hay and timber. "Can't." He didn't look up. "Keep doing the numbers in my head. Wool sale covers maybe half the note. If the cattle bring a fair price in spring, we'll make it. If we have one bad month, one sick animal, one—" "Nathan." Charlotte set the lantern down and crossed to sit beside him, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore. It's not your debt to carry. It's my home too." The words came out before she'd fully considered them, surprising her with their certainty. "Or it's becoming one. I won't pretend I don't have a stake in whether this family survives the winter." Nathan turned to look at her, something raw and unguarded moving across his face in the lantern light. "Family," he repeated softly, like the word was new to him, like he was testing its weight. "Isn't that what we're building?" "Yumi Owen. I didn't expect to want it this badly," Nathan admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "When I wrote that letter, I told myself I just needed help. Someone capable. Someone to keep the house running and watch over Owen while I worked the land." His eyes held hers steady, despite the vulnerability in his voice. "I didn't expect to come home every evening looking forward to the sight of you in that kitchen. I didn't expect Owen's first real laugh in 3 years. I didn't expect any of this, Charlotte, and it scares me more than Hollis and his land schemes ever could." Charlotte's heart pounded so loud she was certain he could hear it. "Why does it scare you?" "Because I've already lost people I loved," he said, the words rough, dragged up from somewhere deep and guarded. "My brother, his wife. I built walls around what was left of my heart, so I'd never have to feel that kind of losing again. And you walked into my kitchen 3 weeks ago in a torn gray dress, and you've been quietly taking those walls apart stone by stone ever since." The lantern light flickered between them, and for a moment, Charlotte thought he might lean closer, thought the space between them might finally close after weeks of careful distance. Weeks of words said and unsaid, of looks held a beat too long. Instead, he stood abruptly, putting careful distance between them once more, like a man pulling back from a ledge. "It's late," he said, voice rough. "You should get some sleep. Big day tomorrow, need to get the last of the wool crated for the morning wagon." Charlotte watched him go, understanding without needing to be told that he wasn't ready, not yet, to say the rest of what was sitting unspoken between them. But she also understood with a certainty that settled warm and steady in her chest, despite the cold barn around her, that something had shifted tonight. Something real. Something that no amount of careful distance would be able to undo. She sat alone in the lantern light a while longer, thinking of Hollis's calculating smile, of the note hanging over this family like a blade waiting to fall, of Owen's fierce declaration that they would not leave the hill where his parents were buried. Whatever was coming this winter, Charlotte understood she would face it not as a stranger earning her keep, not as a woman grateful for scraps of kindness, but as someone who had, against every hard lesson life had taught her, begun to belong somewhere at last. And she intended to fight for it with everything she had. The first hard frost came 2 weeks earlier than Nathan had predicted, settling over the ranch overnight, like a warning nobody had asked for, and Charlotte woke to find ice flowering across her window glass and a tightness in the air that hadn't been there the evening before. "Winter's early," Nathan said at breakfast, jaw set in a way that told Charlotte he was already running numbers in his head, already calculating what an early winter meant for cattle still scattered across high pasture, for hay stores that wouldn't stretch as far if the cold settled in for good. "I need to bring the herd down from the North Range before the passes close. Could be gone 2-3 days." "Take me with you," Charlotte said. Nathan looked up from his plate, surprised. "It's hard riding, Charlotte. Cold, long hours in the saddle, sleeping rough." "I can ride. I can work." She held his gaze steady. "And you'll move faster with 2 sets of hands than 1. Owen needs a—" "Owen can stay with Mrs. Whitfield," Charlotte said, already having thought it through. "He likes her well enough, and it's only a few days. Nathan, if this herd is what stands between us and Hollis getting his hands on this land, then I want to help bring it home." He studied her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that looked like pride fighting against worry. "You're a stubborn woman." "You've said that before. I'll keep saying it," Nathan said, "until you stop proving me right." But he packed a second bedroll that morning, and when they rode out 2 days later, Owen settled safely at the Whitfield place with strict instructions and a promise of fresh bread. When they returned, Charlotte sat a horse beside Nathan with a confidence that surprised them both, years of careful, unacknowledged farm work back in Ohio, finally proving useful for something more than scrubbing another woman's floors. Chapter. The high range was beautiful, in a way that frightened Charlotte a little, all rock and gold grass and sky so wide it made her feel impossibly small. But she didn't let the fear show, working alongside Nathan with a focus that earned by midday something close to admiration in the way he looked at her. You weren't lying about the riding, he said, watching her cut a stray heifer back toward the herd with practiced ease. I told you, I don't lie. No. He agreed, something warm threading through the words. You don't. They worked through the short autumn daylight, gathering cattle scattered across miles of open range. And by the time the sun began sinking toward the mountains, painting the sky in colors Charlotte had never imagined possible, they'd gathered nearly 200 head and pushed them into a sheltered draw for the night. The fire that evening was small, necessary more for warmth than cooking, and Charlotte sat close to it, wrapped in a blanket Nathan had insisted she take from his own bedroll, watching sparks rise up into a sky thick with more stars than she'd known existed. Thank you, Nathan said quietly, staring into the flames. For what? For not letting me do this alone. He glanced at her firelight, catching the lines of his face, softening them somehow. I've done everything alone since my brother died, raising Owen, running this place, fighting off men like Hollis. A pause. I forgot what it felt like to have someone beside me instead of behind me asking what I needed. Charlotte felt something tighten, warm and aching in her chest. You don't have to do it alone anymore. I'm starting to believe that, Nathan admitted, and the rawness in his voice made Charlotte's breath catch. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the fire crackling between them, the vast, dark wilderness pressing close around their small circle of light, and Charlotte felt the pull of him, like gravity. Felt the careful distance they'd both maintained for weeks, growing thinner, more fragile, harder to hold. Charlotte. Her name in his mouth had become something different over these weeks, rougher, warmer. I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. All right. I didn't marry you for Owen's sake. Not really. Not anymore. His eyes held hers across the firelight, unflinching, despite the vulnerability written plain across his face. I told myself that's what this was in the beginning. A practical arrangement. Someone to help with the boy, someone to keep the house running. But somewhere between that first morning in the kitchen and right now, sitting beside this fire, it stopped being practical and started being... A sound cut through the night, sharp and sudden, cattle bawling an alarm somewhere in the dark beyond their firelight, and Nathan was on his feet before the sentence finished, hand going to the rifle propped against his saddle. Stay here, he said, already moving toward the sound. Nathan. Stay by the fire, Charlotte, please. He disappeared into the darkness, and Charlotte sat frozen, heart pounding, straining to hear anything beyond the wind, and the distant, anxious lowing of cattle, the unfinished sentence hanging in the cold air between them, like a promise neither of them had been ready to make. He returned 20 minutes later, breathing hard, rifle lowered but still in hand. Wolf, he said, settling back by the fire, though his shoulders stayed tense. Drove it off. Lost maybe 3 head before I got there, but the rest are settling. You're hurt. Charlotte had already spotted the tear in his sleeve, the dark stain spreading beneath it. Just a scratch. Caught my arm on brush chasing it off. Let me see. Charlotte, it's nothing. Let me see. He sighed, but he sat still and let her peel back his sleeve, revealing a gash along his forearm, ugly but shallow, the kind of wound that needed cleaning more than worry. Charlotte worked quickly, tearing a strip from her own petticoat, without hesitation, cleaning the wound with water from her canteen, wrapping it tight enough to hold until they got home. You didn't have to ruin your petticoat, Nathan said, watching her hands work with a focus that made her fingers feel suddenly clumsy. It's just fabric. You're not. The words hung between them, simple and devastatingly honest, and when Charlotte finally looked up from her work, she found Nathan watching her with an expression that stole the breath clean out of her lungs. What were you going to say? She asked softly. Before the wolf. Nathan's eyes searched her face for a long moment. I was going to say it stopped being practical and started being something I don't have words careful enough for. Something that scares me more than Hollis, more than the note, more than any winter this territory's ever thrown at me. His voice dropped lower, rougher. I think I'm falling in love with you, Charlotte Bennett. And I don't know what to do with that, because every time I've loved something in this life, I've lost it. Charlotte's hand, still wrapped around his bandaged arm, tightened slightly. You haven't lost me. Not yet. Not ever. she said with a fierceness that surprised them both. "If I have any say in it." Nathan's free hand came up slow, almost hesitant, like a man unused to reaching for anything he wanted this badly, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His calloused fingers impossibly gentle against her cheek. "Charlotte." The cattle bawled again, more distant this time, and the moment fractured before it could fully arrive, both of them pulling back with breathless, almost embarrassed laughter. The tension breaking into something lighter, something that still hummed warm beneath the surface, long after they'd settled into their separate bedrolls for what remained of the night. Neither of them slept much. Charlotte lay awake, listening to Nathan's steady breathing a few feet away, replaying his words, the warmth of his hand against her cheek, and understood with sudden clarity that whatever fear had kept her guarded for years was losing its grip slowly, surely, against the steady, patient warmth of a man who had promised her nothing but honesty and somehow given her everything. They brought the herd down 2 days later, exhausted, windburned but triumphant, and Owen ran out to meet the wagon before it had even fully stopped throwing himself against Nathan's legs with an enthusiasm that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks earlier. "You're back," he said, words tumbling out fast, none of the careful rationing Charlotte had grown used to. "Mrs. Whitfield said you might not make it before the snow." "Almost didn't," Nathan admitted, ruffling the boy's hair. "But your stepmother here rides faster than half the men in this territory." Owen looked at Charlotte with something like awe. "Really?" "Your uncle exaggerates," Charlotte said, though she couldn't help the warmth spreading through her chest at the word stepmother spoken so easily, so naturally, like it had always belonged to her. That warmth lasted exactly 3 days before the first real blizzard of the season rolled down off the mountains with a violence that made everything before it feel like a gentle warning. It came without proper announcement, the sky going the color of an old bruise by mid-afternoon wind, picking up sharp and cold enough to cut through wool, and Nathan was already moving before the first snow fell, checking fences securing the barn. His face set with the grim focus of a man who'd weathered enough Montana winters to know exactly how dangerous this one could become. "3 horses are still up in the high pasture," he said, pulling on his heaviest coat as the first flakes began to swirl thick and fast outside the windows. "I have to bring them down before this gets worse." "Nathan, look at the sky." Charlotte's voice carried real fear now, watching the storm darken with frightening speed. "It's already bad. It'll be worse if I leave them out there. They'll freeze, or worse panic, and run themselves into a ravine." He checked his rifle, his rope moving with the efficient urgency of a man who'd made this calculation 100 times before and always come out ahead. "I'll be back before dark. Promise me." He paused at the door, turning back to look at her, and for a moment something passed between them that neither of them had words for, yet something heavier than the promise she'd asked for. "I promise," he said. He rode out into the gathering storm, and Charlotte watched him disappear into the white, until she couldn't see him at all, only the suggestion of movement against a world rapidly losing all its color and shape to the storm. Dark came early, and dark came hard. The storm swallowing the last of the daylight hours before it should have, and by the time true night settled over the ranch, Charlotte stood at the window with Owen pressed silent and frightened against her side, both of them watching a yard that had become an unrecognizable white wilderness, no sign anywhere of Nathan's return. "He should be back," Owen said, voice small. "He will be." Charlotte said it with more confidence than she felt her own heart hammering with a fear she refused to let show. "He knows this land better than anyone." An hour passed, then 2. The storm howled against the timber walls with a force that made the whole house groan, and Charlotte found herself pacing, checking the window every few minutes, every passing moment stretching her nerves thinner. Then she heard it, a horse screaming somewhere out in the white chaos, a sound of pure animal panic that turned Charlotte's blood to ice. She was at the door in seconds, throwing it open against the howling wind, and what she saw in the dim light spilling from the house stopped her heart entirely. Nathan's horse, riderless, lathered and terrified, stumbling into the yard alone. "Nathan." The name tore out of her raw, desperate, swallowed instantly by the wind. There was no answer. No sign of him anywhere in the white, screaming dark. Viet dung so tu chotoinge rachu? Show more. Charlotte's mind raced through every possibility, none of them good, and she forced herself to stop shaking long enough to think. Owen. She turned back into the house, voice steadier than she felt. I need you to be very brave right now. The boy stood in the doorway, face white with fear, but he nodded that same fierce conviction she'd seen in him weeks ago rising up through the terror. What do you need me to do? Stay here. Keep the fire burning. If anyone comes, anyone at all, you let them in, you understand, but you don't go outside, not for anything. You're going after him. I have to. Take Scout. Owen was already moving toward the door, calling for the sheepdog who'd been pacing anxious circles since the horse had screamed. He knows Uncle Nathan's trail better than anyone. He'll find him. Charlotte didn't have time to argue. Didn't have time to consider how reckless this was. A woman alone riding into a blizzard that had already claimed the man best equipped to survive it. She pulled on every layer of clothing she owned, wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders over her coat, and grabbed the lantern from the kitchen table. Charlotte? Owen's voice stopped her at the door, small and scared but steady. Bring him back. I will, she said, and prayed she wasn't lying. The storm hit her like a physical wall the moment she stepped outside. Wind screaming so loud it swallowed every other sound, snow driving sideways with a violence that stole her breath. Scout barked once sharp and urgent, already moving toward the trail that led up toward the high pasture, and Charlotte followed him with a desperation that burned through the cold, through the fear, through every rational voice in her head telling her this was madness. The lantern light barely cut 3 feet through the blinding white. She kept one hand fisted in Scout's collar, trusting the dog's nose and instinct over her own useless eyes, stumbling forward through snow already past her ankles, the wind cutting through her layers like they were nothing at all. Nathan! Her voice tore raw against the storm. Nathan! Nothing answered but the wind. She thought of Owen's mother and father burned alive in a fire that had taken everything from him. She thought of a boy who had already lost one set of parents to tragedy, who wouldn't lose another. She thought of Nathan's voice by the campfire, rough and honest, telling her he was falling in love with her, and the unfinished promise that storm had stolen from them both. She would not let this storm finish what the fire had started 3 years ago. Scout's bark changed pitch, suddenly sharp and insistent, and Charlotte's heart lurched as the dog surged forward, nearly pulling free of her grip. She stumbled after him, lantern swinging, wild snow stinging her face like 1,000 small knives, until the light caught something dark against the endless white. A horse. Down. Struggling weakly in the snow, one leg bent at an angle that made Charlotte's stomach turn, and beneath the broken branches of a fallen pine, half buried already, a shape that didn't move at all. Nathan. She was on her knees beside him before conscious thought caught up with action hands tearing snow away from his still form, finding his face white and cold beneath her fingers, his eyes closed, no sound of breathing she could hear over the howling wind. Nathan, please. Her voice cracked, tears freezing on her cheeks almost as fast as they fell. Please, don't you dare. Don't you dare leave me now. She pressed her fingers to his throat, desperate searching, and found it faint, sluggish, but there. A pulse. He was alive. Beneath him, pinned by his own body, the injured colt that had clearly caused this whole disaster trembled weakly, and Charlotte understood in an instant what had happened. Nathan had thrown himself over the animal when the tree came down, shielding it with his own body, taking the full weight of falling timber, rather than let the colt be crushed. He had nearly died protecting a horse. The thought should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, it only confirmed everything she already understood about the kind of man Nathan Carter was. I need you to wake up, she said, working frantically to clear the snow and broken branches from around him, checking his limbs for breaks with hands that shook from cold and terror both. I can't carry you, Nathan. I can't get you back to the house alone. I need you to help me. His eyelids fluttered. A groan barely audible over the wind, but it was the most beautiful sound Charlotte had ever heard. Charlotte. His voice was a rasp, barely there. "I'm here. I'm here, you fool, scaring me half to death." "Colt." He managed even now, even half frozen and broken beneath a fallen tree, more worried about the animal than himself. "Is the Colt alive? Same as you for now, but only if you help me get us both out of this storm." Charlotte's voice was fierce, desperate. "Can you move your legs?" It took everything they both had. Nathan, dazed and weak from cold, and the blow that had knocked him senseless, managed to drag himself free of the worst of the branches, with Charlotte's help his face going gray with pain when he tried to put weight on his right leg. "Ankle," he gritted out. "Not broken, I think. Just enough to make this difficult." Charlotte got his arm over her shoulders, bracing herself against his weight, against the screaming wind, against every instinct telling her this was impossible. "We need shelter. Now." There was a rock outcropping 20 feet away, barely more than an overhang. But it was something a break against the worst of the wind, and Charlotte half-dragged, half-carried Nathan toward it, while Scout circled anxious and whining around them both. Getting him settled against the rock face took the last of her strength, but she didn't stop there. She gathered what dry brush she could find beneath the overhang, fumbling with frozen fingers for the matches she'd had the foresight to grab on her way out the door, and after 3 failed attempts, a small flame finally caught and held. "You came after me," Nathan said, watching her work, his voice still weak, but his eyes, when they found hers in the firelight, burning with something fierce and disbelieving. "Alone. Into this. Did you expect me to sit by the fire and wait? I expected you to have more sense. Then you still don't know me very well," Charlotte said, feeding the small fire with everything she could find, building it as large as she dared beneath the rock overhang. "Because I have never once in my entire life sat quietly and waited for someone else to fix what was broken." Nathan's hand found hers in the firelight, weak but insistent, pulling it toward him until their fingers laced together. "I love you." He said the words, finally breaking free after weeks of careful restraint. No firelight interruption this time to steal them away. "I should have said it that night by the cattle. I should have said it every day since. I love you, Charlotte Bennett, and I am not losing you to this storm, or to Hollis, or to anything else this world tries to throw between us." Charlotte's eyes burned with tears that had nothing to do with the cold. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for weeks. I just didn't know how to trust it." "Trust it now," Nathan said, pulling her closer, sharing what little warmth they had between them. "Because I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." The night that followed was the longest of Charlotte's life. She kept the fire burning through hours that stretched endless and terrifying, feeding it every scrap of brush within reach, pressing herself close against Nathan to share body heat, while the storm raged on outside their thin shelter, refusing to let herself sleep, even as exhaustion clawed at every part of her. Nathan drifted in and out of consciousness, fever building from the cold and the injury, mumbling things that broke Charlotte's heart further with every hour. Apologies to his dead brother for not protecting Owen. Well enough fragments of fear about losing the ranch, and twice clear as anything. Her own name spoken with a tenderness that undid her completely. "Stay with me," she whispered into the howling dark, holding him as close as she could, willing her own warmth into his too-cold body. "Stay with me, Nathan. Owen needs you. I need you. We didn't come this far for it to end here." Scout pressed close against them both, a small but steady source of additional warmth, and somewhere in the deepest, darkest hours before dawn, Charlotte found herself praying for the first time in years, bargaining with a God she'd stopped speaking to after her mother died, promising anything, everything, if only the morning would come, and Nathan would still be breathing when it did. When the morning came gray and brutal, the storm finally beginning to break, and Charlotte's relief at seeing Nathan's eyes open weak but alert nearly buckled her knees entirely. "We need to get back," she said, helping him to his feet, his weight heavy against her shoulder, but his strength returning enough to bear some of it himself. "Owen will be terrified." "The Colt? I'll send someone back for it the moment we're safe. Nathan, please, you need real warmth, real shelter, your fingers, your face. She didn't finish the sentence, too afraid of the word frostbite to say it aloud, but she'd seen enough of his hands in the gray morning light to know the damage was real. They made it back to the ranch house, just as full daylight broke over the mountains, and Owen's scream of relief at seeing them stumble through the door alive together was a sound Charlotte knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The doctor arrived from town 6 hours later, summoned by a neighbor. Charlotte had sent writing the moment they'd made it home, and his verdict was grim, but not catastrophic. Frostbite severe in 3 fingers, on Nathan's right hand and across both feet. A sprained ankle badly swollen but not broken. Exhaustion and exposure that would take weeks to fully recover from. He won't be working for at least 6 weeks, the doctor said, packing his bag, while Nathan slept fitfully in the next room, fever finally breaking after a long, terrifying day. Possibly longer, depending on how the fingers heal. He's lucky to have all of them at all, Mrs. Carter. Another hour out there, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Charlotte absorbed this with a steadiness that surprised her even as fear coiled tight in her stomach. What does he need? Rest, warmth, someone to change those dressings twice daily and watch for infection. The doctor's eyes were kind but serious. And someone to keep this ranch running while he heals, because a man recovering from frostbite isn't fit for cattle work or much else for some time. After the doctor left, Charlotte sat alone at the kitchen table with the full weight of their situation pressing down on her. 6 weeks at minimum of Nathan unable to work. 6 weeks with the spring cattle drive looming with the note still hanging over their heads, with Hollis circling like a vulture waiting for exactly this kind of weakness. She thought of the women in green wool coats at the train station, certain she'd never survive a Montana winter. She thought of every voice that had ever told her she wasn't capable, wasn't enough, wasn't worth the investment. Charlotte Bennett stood up from that table with a fire in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove beside her. She would not let this family fall, not to frostbite, not to winter, and most certainly not to Garrett Hollis. She rode into Iron Creek 3 days later, leaving Owen to watch over his sleeping uncle, with strict instructions and a fierce newfound responsibility that the boy carried with surprising maturity, and walked into the cattle broker's office with a confidence she'd had to build from nothing. Stitch by careful stitch, the same way she'd built everything else in her life. Mrs. Carter. The broker, a heavy-set man named Pierce, looked up with poorly disguised surprise. I was expecting Nathan. Nathan's recovering from frostbite, Charlotte said, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for invitation. I'm here to discuss the wool contract, and I'd like to discuss the spring cattle sale as well, given the circumstances. Pierce's eyebrows rose. With respect, Mrs. Carter, cattle negotiations aren't typically handled by women. Yes, I'm aware. Charlotte kept her voice level, pleasant, but immovable. I'm also aware that you offered Nathan 11 cents a pound on last year's wool, when the going rate in Bozeman was 13. I have the newspaper clipping in my bag if you'd like to see it. Pierce's mouth opened, then closed. I'm not interested in being cheated because my husband is laid up and you assume his wife won't know any better. Charlotte continued. I'd like 13 cents a pound, same as Bozeman, or I'll take our wool there myself, however long the ride. The negotiation that followed took the better part of an hour. Charlotte holding firm on every point with a calm steel that surprised even her, drawing on every hard lesson 6 years of being underestimated had taught her. She walked out with a contract at 12.5 cents a pound, not quite what Bozeman offered, but close enough and far better than Pierce's opening insult. It was the first of many such conversations that winter. Charlotte negotiated feed prices with the general store, secured a fair rate on next spring's cattle sale. Despite 3 ranchers initially refusing to discuss business with a woman at all, and slowly, steadily began earning something Charlotte hadn't expected to find in Iron Creek. Respect. You did what? Nathan stared at her from his chair by the fire, his bandaged hand resting carefully in his lap. Disbelief written plain across his face as Charlotte recounted the week's business. I negotiated the wool contract and the spring cattle sale, and I told Pierce exactly what I thought of his attempt to cheat us. Charlotte set a cup of tea in front of him, unable to keep the satisfaction from her voice. We're going to be fine, Nathan. Better than fine. I think we might actually clear the note by summer if the cattle sell at the rate I negotiated. Nathan stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time all over again, the same way he had on that train platform weeks ago, except now, the look held nothing but pure, unguarded wonder. You rode into town alone and negotiated business that's taken me years to learn how to handle properly. I had good motivation, Charlotte. His good hand reached for hers, gripping tight despite the bandages on the other. 3 weeks ago, half that town was calling you a beggar who trapped a rich rancher. Now you're telling me Pierce backed down from a woman half his size because she had a newspaper clipping and better arithmetic than he did. People believe what's convenient until they're shown otherwise, Charlotte said simply. I just made it inconvenient to keep believing it. Nathan laughed. Real laughter, the kind Charlotte hadn't heard from him before, rough with disuse, but genuine, warming something deep in her chest. I think, he said, still chuckling, pulling her down to sit beside him, despite his injuries, that I married the most remarkable woman in this entire territory, and it took me nearly losing my life in a blizzard to fully understand how lucky I am. You didn't marry me for luck, Charlotte reminded him softly. You married me because my letter didn't lie. No. Nathan agreed, his eyes warm and steady on hers. I married you because somewhere underneath that torn dress was the strongest, most honest person I'd ever met. I just didn't know yet how much stronger you'd prove yourself to be. Outside, the last of the storm clouds finally broke apart, revealing a sky scrubbed clean and bright sunlight spilling across snow that had so recently nearly taken everything from them. And Charlotte allowed herself for the first time since arriving in Iron Creek to believe completely that whatever still lay ahead, she would not be facing it alone. Spring announced itself slowly that year. Snowmelt running silver down the mountainsides, the first green pushing up stubborn through ground that had been frozen solid for what felt like a lifetime. And with it came a letter that nearly undid everything Charlotte had spent the winter building. She found Nathan reading it at the kitchen table, his face gone hard in a way she hadn't seen since Hollis first approached them outside the feed store, the bandages long gone from his hand now. But the 3 fingers still stiff, still healing slower than the rest of him. What is it? Hollis. He set the letter down jaw tight. He's gone to the bank, bought up our note from them directly. Says if we're not current by the 1st of June, he's calling the whole debt due, and he knows full well we don't have that kind of money sitting in a drawer. Charlotte's stomach dropped. Can he do that? Legally, I don't know. I need to talk to someone who actually understands the law better than I do. Nathan dragged a hand down his face, the old exhaustion creeping back into his shoulders despite the better months behind them. We were supposed to have until autumn for the full note. This isn't right, Charlotte. This isn't how the original agreement read. Then show me the original agreement. He looked up at her, something flickering behind the worry in his eyes, not quite hope, but close enough to it that Charlotte felt her own resolve harden in response. You think you can find something Hollis missed? I think, Charlotte said, already reaching for the strongbox where Nathan kept his papers, that a man confident in his legal standing doesn't usually rush this hard to force a deadline. Confident men wait. Desperate men push. She spent 3 days buried in paperwork, reading every line of the original mortgage agreement until her eyes burned, cross-referencing dates against the letter Hollis had sent against bank records Nathan had kept meticulously, despite his exhaustion through the difficult months. She found small things, first inconsistencies in dates, a payment schedule that didn't quite match what Nathan remembered signing. Then on the 3rd night, working by lamplight, long after Nathan and Owen had gone to sleep, she found it. The signature on the transfer document, the one supposedly authorizing the bank to sell Nathan's note to Hollis, didn't match the bank manager's signature on 3 other documents in the same file. Her hands trembled as she laid the papers side by side, comparing the loops and slants of each letter, the pressure of each stroke. She wasn't a handwriting expert, but she didn't need to be one to see what was plainly, undeniably wrong. Nathan. She was at his door before she'd fully thought through waking him, papers clutched in her hands. "Nathan, wake up. I think I found something." He came awake fast, alert, in the way of a man who'd spent too many years bracing for bad news, and followed her back to the kitchen table where the lamp still burned. "Look." She spread the documents in front of him. "This signature on the transfer authorization, compare it to this one on the original mortgage, and this one from last spring's renewal." Nathan studied them for a long moment, his face going carefully blank in the way Charlotte had learned meant he was working hard to control a reaction. "These aren't the same hand," he said slowly. "No, they're not." "You think the transfer's forged?" "I think," Charlotte said carefully, "that someone wanted this note sold to Hollis badly enough to fake the bank manager's authorization. And I think we need to find out who, because if I'm right, this isn't just about an early deadline anymore. This is fraud." The next morning they rode into town together, the documents carefully wrapped and carried in Charlotte's bag, and went straight to the Territorial Land Office instead of the bank where a young clerk named Whitcomb listened to their concerns with growing unease. "Mr. Aldridge handles all the mortgage transfers," Whitcomb said, glancing nervously toward the bank manager's closed office door. "If you're saying his signature was forged—" "I'm saying it doesn't match," Charlotte corrected. "I'd like to ask Mr. Aldridge directly." Aldridge, when they were finally shown into his office, went pale the moment Charlotte laid the documents in front of him. "This isn't my signature," he said, after a long, uncomfortable silence, his voice tight with something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. "I never authorized this transfer. I never even saw this document before." "Then how did Hollis end up holding our note?" Nathan's voice had gone dangerous low and controlled in a way Charlotte had only heard once before, the day he'd nearly ridden into town to confront Mrs. Whitfield over gossip. Aldridge's eyes darted toward the door, toward the street outside, like he was checking who might be listening. "I need to show you something," he said quietly. "But not here. Not where anyone from this bank might see." What followed was a conversation that changed everything Charlotte thought she understood about Garrett Hollis. Aldridge meeting them later that evening at his own home away from prying eyes, and Hollis's considerable influence in town, laid out a scheme that had clearly been building for years, forged signatures on at least 4 other ranch transfers in the valley, all of them sold quietly to Hollis at prices far below their actual worth. All of them ranchers, too, overwhelmed by hardship or grief to closely examine the paperwork that had supposedly authorized their losses. "He's been doing this since before your brother died." Aldridge admitted to Nathan guilt, written plain across his face. "I should have come forward sooner. I was afraid Hollis has friends in the territorial government, friends who could ruin me with a word if I crossed him." "You're crossing him now," Charlotte pointed out, "because you found proof I couldn't ignore." Aldridge looked between them both, something resolved settling into his expression. "I'll testify, whatever it takes. I won't have any more families losing their land to a thief with a forged pen." The territorial circuit judge arrived in Iron Creek 3 weeks later, and the courtroom that assembled to hear the case against Garrett Hollis was packed wall to wall with ranchers from across the valley, some who'd already lost land to his schemes, others who'd simply come to watch the spectacle of the wealthy land speculator finally facing consequences. Charlotte sat beside Nathan at the front of the room, Owen between them, the boy's small hand gripped tight in hers as the proceedings began, and she felt the weight of every eye in that courtroom. The same eyes that had once watched her step off a train in a torn gray dress and judged her unworthy of the life she now fought to protect. Hollis's lawyer tried every angle, questioning the validity of Charlotte's discovery, suggesting she'd manipulated the documents herself, painting her as a desperate woman, willing to fabricate evidence to save a failing ranch. "Mrs. Carter," the lawyer said, voice dripping with practiced condescension, "you arrived in this territory with nothing but a torn dress and a single bag. Isn't it true you have every motivation to fabricate evidence that might save your husband's failing operation?" Charlotte felt Nathan's hand tighten on her shoulder, felt the old urge rise up in her to shrink, to apologize, to make herself small enough that the cruelty would slide past without catching. She did not shrink. I arrived with nothing because I'd spent 6 years working for a woman who docked my pay over broken dishes, Charlotte said, voice steady, carrying clear across the silent courtroom. I learned in those years exactly how to read a contract closely because the women who exploit servants count on those servants never reading the fine print. I didn't fabricate Mr. Aldridge's signature, sir. I simply noticed it didn't match. Any honest clerk in this room could confirm the same if Mr. Hollis hadn't already paid off 3 of them to look the other way. A murmur swept through the courtroom. The lawyer's confident expression faltered. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Carter. It's a serious crime, counselor, Charlotte answered. I'd be happy to provide the judge with the names if Mr. Aldridge hasn't already. The trial lasted 4 days. By the end of it, the truth had unraveled completely. Hollis's pattern of forged signatures laid bare for the entire valley. To see 3 additional ranchers stepping forward, once Aldridge's confession, gave them courage, each describing land lost under circumstances eerily similar to what Hollis had attempted with Nathan's ranch. The judge's verdict, when it finally came, was unambiguous. Every fraudulent transfer voided. Hollis stripped of every illegally acquired property in the territory, facing federal charges for fraud that would likely see him imprisoned for years to come. Nathan's note restored to its original terms, original bank, original fair agreement. When the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted. Not in the cruel whispers Charlotte remembered from her first day in Iron Creek, but in something else entirely. Applause. Genuine warm applause directed at the woman who'd arrived in rags and somehow saved half the valley from a predator hiding behind expensive suits and practiced smiles. Mrs. Carter, a rancher Charlotte didn't recognize, approached after the courtroom cleared, hat in hand, something like shame in his weathered face. I was one of the fools who laughed at you on that train platform. I'm sorry for it. Genuinely sorry. Charlotte accepted his apology with more grace than she felt the moment deserved, but she understood, watching face after face approach with similar words, similar regret, that something fundamental had shifted in how Iron Creek saw her. She was no longer the rag bride. She was the woman who'd saved the valley. That evening, beneath cottonwood trees just beginning to bud with the first green of true spring, Nathan led Charlotte away from the house, away from Owen's curious eyes, to a quiet spot overlooking the creek that had nearly caused them to lose everything. I have something to ask you, he said, and Charlotte noticed his hands trembling slightly, an unfamiliar nervousness on a man who'd faced down blizzards and frostbite and federal courtrooms without flinching. Nathan, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket, not legal, not official, just simple paper worn soft from handling. This is our original arrangement, the agreement I sent you back before you ever stepped off that train. Charlotte recognized it instantly, her own careful handwriting visible where she'd signed her acceptance, agreeing to terms that had once felt like the only lifeline she'd been offered in years. Nathan tore it in half. Nathan, I asked for someone to help raise a child, he said, voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. I asked for someone capable, honest, willing to work. I never imagined God would send me a woman who'd heal 3 broken hearts, instead mine, Owen's, and apparently half this valley's, judging by how many ranchers just thanked you for saving their land too. He knelt right there beneath the budding cottonwoods, careful of his still healing ankle, and Charlotte's breath caught entirely. I'm not asking you to be my wife out of obligation anymore, Nathan said. I'm not asking because the bank needs to see a married man, or because Owen needs a mother, or because this arrangement was ever meant to be practical instead of real. His eyes held hers steady and certain, despite the vulnerability written plain across his face. I'm asking because I love you, Charlotte Bennett, more completely than I knew it was possible to love anyone. Will you marry me? Not the woman I ordered through a letter. You, exactly as you are. Tears spilled freely down Charlotte's face, and she found she didn't care, didn't feel the old urge to hide them or apologize for them. Yes, she said, pulling him up to standing so she could throw her arms around him properly. Yes, 1,000 times. Yes, though, I'd remind you, we're already married, Nathan Carter. Not like this, he murmured against her hair. Not for love. I want to marry you for love properly, in front of everyone who once doubted you. Their second wedding, the real one as Charlotte privately thought of it, took place 3 weeks later beneath those same cottonwood trees, attended not by strangers fulfilling an obligation, but by neighbors who'd once whispered cruelty, and now arrived bearing gifts, genuine warmth, hard-won respect, carved out through one impossibly difficult winter. Owen stood beside Nathan as his solemn, proud witness, wearing a new suit Charlotte had sewn herself. His face split into a smile that had become so much more common over these past months, the silent, grieving boy slowly transforming into a child capable of joy again. Mrs. Whitfield of all people cried through the entire short ceremony, having become somewhere in the months between gossip and gratitude one of Charlotte's closest friends in the valley. I never apologized properly, she admitted afterward, embracing Charlotte with genuine warmth. For the things I said that first week. I judged you by your dress instead of your character, and I am deeply sincerely sorry for it. You're forgiven, Charlotte said, and meant it completely. Understanding now that the woman who'd once gossiped so cruelly had simply never met anyone who'd taught her better, the way Charlotte herself had once needed someone to look past her torn dress and see what waited underneath. Years passed the way years do. Quietly at first, then suddenly the way Charlotte would later describe it to anyone who asked, each season blending into the next, until one day she looked up and found an entire decade had reshaped everything around her. The ranch flourished, becoming within 5 years one of the most respected operations in the territory, known not just for the quality of its cattle, but for the fairness of its dealings. A reputation built carefully, deliberately, by two people who understood exactly what it cost to be treated otherwise. Owen grew tall and steady, the silent, grief-stricken boy transforming into a thoughtful young man who credited Charlotte whenever anyone asked with teaching him that kindness was never a weakness, that gentleness and strength could live comfortably within the very same heart. She taught me that the people everyone underestimates are usually the strongest people in the room, Owen told a young ranch hand once years later, not realizing Charlotte was close enough to overhear. She arrived with nothing but a torn dress, and she ended up saving this whole valley. Charlotte and Nathan had 2 more children together in the years that followed, a son who shared his father's quiet steadiness, and a daughter who'd inherited her mother's fierce, unshakable spirit, and the old carpet bag Charlotte had carried off that train so many years ago, still hung in the front hallway of their home, weathered and worn, but never discarded. "Mama, why do you keep that old bag?" their daughter asked one evening, years later. Young enough still to find the question genuinely puzzling, old enough to notice the bag had been hanging in that same spot for as long as she could remember. "It's so old and torn. Papa could buy you 100 new ones." Charlotte knelt down to her daughter's level, the same patient, steady warmth she'd once offered a silent, grieving boy, now extended easily to her own child. "Because this old bag reminds me," she said softly, "that the poorest day of my life became the richest day of my future. I arrived in this valley with nothing but that bag and a letter from your father, and everyone who saw me believed I had nothing left to offer the world." "But you did," her daughter said, certain of it. "I did," Charlotte agreed. "I just needed someone willing to look past the torn dress and see what was underneath." Nathan, listening from the doorway, crossed the room and took Charlotte's hand. The same calloused, steady grip that had helped her up onto a wagon seat decades earlier. The same hand that had nearly frozen saving an injured colt in a blizzard. The same hand that had torn up an obligation and asked her freely to stay forever instead. "Everyone saw your rags," he said, voice still rough after all these years, still carrying that same quiet honesty that had drawn her to him from the very first conversation on that train platform. "I saw the woman I wanted beside me for the rest of my life." Outside, the Montana sun set golden across a valley that had tested them, nearly broken them, and ultimately given them everything that mattered. A home built not on convenience or obligation, but on the unshakable foundation of 2 people who had chosen each other fully and freely, long after any practical reason required it. The greatest miracle of Iron Creek was never that a poor woman in a torn gray dress found a home in a stranger's house. It was that a guarded, grieving cowboy looked past every rag, every whisper, every reason the world gave him to doubt her, and recognized instead the priceless heart hidden beneath a heart strong enough to heal a broken family, brave enough to face down a blizzard and a courtroom both, and steady enough to build from nothing but honesty and unwavering courage, a love that lasted every single day for the rest of their lives. I'll write an extension that picks up after the wedding and before the time skip ending, giving room for a new dramatic arc that resolves into the same warm conclusion. The first sign that Hollis hadn't truly finished with them came on an ordinary Tuesday, nearly 2 months after the wedding, when a stranger rode into the yard asking for Nathan by name and refusing to state his business to anyone else. Charlotte watched from the kitchen window as the man dismounted expensive coat dusted with trail dirt, the kind of careful, unhurried movement that belonged to someone used to delivering bad news for a living. "Nathan Carter?" the stranger asked when Nathan came out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Foster. I represent certain interests connected to Mr. Garrett Hollis." The man's voice carried the flat, practiced courtesy of someone who'd said unpleasant things to a great many people and learned to say them without flinching. "I understand congratulations are in order. Your wedding, I mean. The real one." Nathan's whole body went still, in a way Charlotte recognized instantly, the same coiled tension she'd seen the day Hollis first approached them outside the feed store. "Hollis is in federal custody," Nathan said, "awaiting sentencing. What business could his lawyer possibly have out here? I'm not his lawyer." Foster reached into his coat, slow and deliberate, producing a folded document. "I'm executor of a trust Mr. Hollis established some years back, structured in a way that survives his current, unfortunate circumstances. The trust holds the deed to a parcel adjoining your eastern boundary. 60 acres including the upper portion of your creek." Charlotte was already moving toward the door, drawn by an instinct that told her this conversation needed her presence as much as Nathan's. "That land's mine," Nathan said. "Has been since my father homesteaded it. According to the survey Mr. Hollis commissioned 3 years ago, the boundary runs differently than you believe." Foster's smile was thin, professional, utterly without warmth. "I'm not here to argue the point today, Mr. Carter. I'm here to inform you the trust intends to file a boundary dispute with the territorial court. 60 acres including your primary water source. I'd encourage you to retain proper counsel." He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode out exactly as unhurried as he'd arrived, leaving behind a silence that felt to Charlotte far heavier than anything Hollis himself had managed to inflict in person. "He's reaching from prison," Charlotte said that evening, the survey papers Nathan kept in his strongbox spread across the kitchen table once more, the same table where she'd once found the forged signature that had unraveled everything. "Even behind bars, he's still trying to take this land. Or someone's using his name to try something new." Nathan rubbed his eyes, exhaustion creeping back into his shoulders in a way Charlotte hadn't seen since the worst of the winter. "Doesn't matter which. Either way, we're back in a courtroom. Then we'll be ready for it." Charlotte reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "We've done this before. This is different." Nathan's voice carried a weight she didn't immediately understand. "Charlotte, the creek headwaters are on that disputed parcel. If they win this even partially, we lose our primary water source. Not just inconvenient, catastrophic. We'd lose the herd within 2 seasons. The full danger of it settled cold in Charlotte's chest. This wasn't a matter of pride, or even of the note anymore. This was survival, plain and simple, the same brutal arithmetic that had nearly broken them before Charlotte had ever arrived in Iron Creek. "Then we find out everything we can about that survey," she said, "and we find it faster than they expect." The weeks that followed felt in some ways like a strange echo of the winter, before Charlotte, once again buried in paperwork late into the night, riding into town to consult records, building a case stitch by careful stitch the same way she'd once built a wardrobe of mended shirts from nothing. But this time she wasn't alone in it, and that made all the difference. Owen, now 10 and far more confident than the silent boy who'd first watched her arrive, took to writing the boundary line with a notebook Charlotte had given him, sketching the natural landmarks his father and grandfather had always used. To mark the property, an old lightning-split oak, a cluster of granite boulders, the bend where the creek doubled back on itself before continuing downstream. "Grandpa used to tell me stories about this tree," Owen said one afternoon, standing beneath the scarred oak with Charlotte beside him, both of them studying its blackened split trunk. "Said it marked exactly where Carter land started, before Hollis's survey anyway." "How do you know that?" "Papa told me, and Papa's papa told him." Owen looked up at her, something steady and certain in his young face. "That's older than any paper Hollis's lawyers got." Charlotte felt something click into place, an idea forming with the same clarity she'd felt the night she'd first noticed the mismatched signature. "Owen," she said slowly, "I need you to introduce me to everyone in this valley who remembers your grandfather's original survey." What followed was perhaps the most challenging legal battle Charlotte had yet undertaken. Though this time the fraud wasn't a forged signature, but something more insidious. A survey commissioned and paid for by Hollis himself 3 years prior, conducted by a surveyor whose credentials Charlotte discovered, after considerable digging, had quietly lapsed the year before he'd drawn the disputed boundary lines. "He wasn't licensed," she told Nathan, triumph and disbelief warring in her voice as she laid out the territorial licensing records she'd finally tracked down through a clerk in the capital 3 weeks and countless letters after she'd first begun searching. The man Hollis paid to survey this land hadn't held a valid surveyor's license in over a year when he drew these boundaries. The whole document is worthless. Nathan stared at the records like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "You found this from paperwork in the capital, Charlotte, that's 200 miles away." "I wrote letters," she said simply. "I asked questions until someone finally answered them honestly. The same way I always have." But even with the unlicensed surveyor's records in hand, Foster's Trust didn't simply withdraw the claim, and the matter proceeded toward another courtroom date, this one carrying stakes that frightened Charlotte more than the original fraud trial ever had. Because this time, losing meant losing the water that kept their entire herd, their entire livelihood alive. The night before the hearing, Charlotte found Nathan standing alone at the edge of the disputed boundary, staring out at the creek in the gathering dark, his face carrying an exhaustion that went deeper than simple tiredness. "I keep thinking about my father," he said, not turning when she approached. "He homesteaded this land with nothing but a wagon and a promise to my mother that he'd build something that would outlast them both. I keep thinking about what it would mean to lose even a piece of it now, after everything we've already survived to keep it. We're not losing it." Charlotte slipped her hand into his, steady and certain. "You don't know that. I know the surveyor wasn't licensed. I know Owen's notebook full of landmarks tells the same story 3 generations of neighbors will confirm under oath. I know we have truth on our side, the same as we did with Hollis the first time." Charlotte turned to face him, fully searching his eyes in the fading light. "Nathan, I have never once watched you back down from a fight worth having. Don't start tonight." Something shifted in his expression, the exhaustion giving way slowly to something more like resolve. "When did you become the one talking me through fear instead of the other way around?" "Probably the same night you talked me through mine beside a fire on the high range when I didn't yet believe I deserved to stay." Nathan pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the creek murmuring quietly beside them in the dark. The same water that had nearly become the center of their undoing, now simply flowing on, indifferent and eternal, exactly as it had for generations before either of them was born. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said finally, "I want you to know none of it changes what I already have. You, Owen, this family we built out of nothing but a torn dress and a desperate letter." His voice roughened. "Hollis can take the water if some corrupt court lets him. He already lost the only thing that ever actually mattered." The hearing the next morning drew a crowd nearly as large as the original fraud trial word, having spread through the valley, that the Carter Ranch was once again fighting for its survival. And Charlotte felt the difference immediately in how the courtroom regarded her. Now, Not the curious, judgmental stares of strangers assessing a beggar bride, but the warm, expectant attention of neighbors who had watched her prove herself capable again and again across 2 difficult years. Foster presented his case with cold efficiency. The original survey laid out in precise, official-looking detail, and for a moment, watching the judge study the documents with careful attention, Charlotte felt the old fear rise, the fear of being disbelieved, dismissed, overruled by official paper, despite knowing with absolute certainty that the truth stood on her side. Then it was her turn. "Your Honor," she began, voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "I'd like to submit territorial licensing records showing the surveyor who drew this disputed boundary held no valid license at the time the survey was conducted." A murmur swept the courtroom. Foster's confident expression flickered for the first time. "Furthermore," Charlotte continued, "I have sworn statements from 7 neighboring ranchers, several present in this courtroom today, confirming the boundary their families have recognized for 3 generations. A boundary marked by natural landmarks predating any paper survey. Landmarks consistent with the deed originally filed by Mr. Carter's father in this very courthouse dated 11 years before Mr. Hollis ever set foot in this territory." One by one, the neighbors Charlotte and Owen had spent weeks visiting Rose to confirm what they'd always known: the lightning split oak, the granite boulders, the bend in the creek, every landmark exactly where 3 generations of honest memory placed them. Foster's case crumbled steadily over the course of the morning. The unlicensed survey exposed as worthless, the trust's claim revealed as nothing more than Hollis's final desperate attempt to inflict damage from behind prison bars, executed through a representative who'd clearly believed wrongly that grief and exhaustion would prevent the Carters from fighting back with the same fierce determination that had unmasked Hollis's fraud the first time. When the judge's ruling finally came, it was unambiguous and immediate. The disputed survey voided entirely. The original boundary confirmed by deed, by neighbor testimony, by simple honest memory, restored without question. The trust's claim dismissed with prejudice, and a pointed warning from the judge that any further attempts to harass the Carter family through fraudulent legal maneuvering would result in contempt charges against everyone involved. The celebration that followed back at the ranch that evening felt different from the quiet relief after the first trial, louder, warmer, filled with neighbors who'd come not out of obligation, but genuine friendship, bringing food and laughter, and the easy camaraderie of people who'd watched a family fight for everything and finally completely win. "You should have seen Foster's face," Owen said gleefully, recounting the courtroom scene for what felt like the 10th time to anyone who'd listen, when Mrs. Abernathy stood up and said she'd known that oak tree since before his client was even born. "You did good work finding all those neighbors," Charlotte told him, watching pride bloom across his young face at the praise. "That notebook of yours probably won this case as much as anything I found in the licensing records. I learned that from you," Owen said simply. "You taught me that the truth's always there if you're patient enough to find it." Later, after the neighbors had finally gone home, and Owen had fallen asleep exhausted by the day's excitement, Charlotte found Nathan sitting on the porch steps where they'd shared so many quiet, pivotal conversations over the past 2 years, looking out at land that was finally and completely secure. "It's really over," he said as she settled beside him. "Hollis can't touch us anymore. Not through fraud, not through some trust, not through anything. We're free of him completely." "We were always going to win," Charlotte said, leaning into his shoulder. "Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, if you're stubborn enough to keep digging for it. I used to think strength meant never needing anyone else." Nathan's arm came around her, pulling her close against the evening chill. "You taught me different. You taught me real strength is knowing exactly who to stand beside when the fighting gets hard." Charlotte tilted her face up to his, the same steady warmth in his eyes that had first surprised her on that train platform, the same warmth that had grown slowly and surely into something neither of them had been brave enough to name at first. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you," he answered, "more today than I did yesterday, and somehow impossibly less than I'll love you tomorrow." He kissed her there on the porch steps, gentle and certain, the kind of kiss that carried no more uncertainty, no more careful distance. Nothing held back at all, and somewhere above them, the same vast Montana sky that had once frightened Charlotte, with its enormous emptiness, now simply felt at last completely and unshakably like home. The following spring, when the cottonwoods budded once more and the creek ran high with snowmelt secure and entirely theirs, Nathan planted roses by the porch, the same flowers Owen had once described losing in the fire. That took his parents, grown now, from cuttings a neighboring rancher's wife had carefully provided. Planted exactly where Owen asked, in memory of a garden that had once burned and a mother who had loved it. Charlotte watched her son. For that was exactly what Owen had become to her. Whatever blood or law might technically say, otherwise kneel in the dirt beside his father, patting soil carefully around fragile new roots. His face open and unguarded, in a way that would have seemed impossible the day she'd first arrived. "Will they bloom this summer?" Owen asked. "Maybe not the first year," Nathan said. "Roses take patience, but they'll bloom eventually. Strong things always do if you give them enough care and enough time." Charlotte thought of a torn gray dress, a split carpet bag, a desperate letter that had promised nothing but honesty and somehow delivered everything that mattered. She thought of every voice that had once doubted her, every door that had once seemed permanently closed, every cold and frightened night she'd survived, believing she had nothing left to offer a world that had given her so very little in return. She had been wrong about so much in those early days. Wrong about what she carried, wrong about what she was worth, wrong about whether anyone could ever look past the rags and see the person waiting patiently underneath. But Nathan Carter had seen her from the very first moment, even disguised in his own gruff uncertainty, even before either of them understood what they were truly building together. And in seeing her, he had given Charlotte something far more valuable than security or comfort, or even love itself. He had given her the unshakable certainty that she had always from the very beginning been enough exactly as she was. The roses bloomed the following June, vivid red against the timber walls of a home that had weathered fraud and frostbite and blizzards and courtrooms and emerged every single time stronger than before. Proof, if anyone in Iron Creek still needed it, that the poorest day of a person's life could become, with enough courage and enough love, the foundation of the richest life imaginable. And that was the truth Charlotte Bennett Carter carried with her every single day that followed, etched as deep and permanent into her heart as the worn leather handle of an old carpet bag, still hanging proudly by her front door.